This conference will now be recorded.
Okay, so let me go ahead, just create a quick resource group out here. And let me go into it and let me try creating a web app, let's say in, central India. Let's say create. Likely I should be able to create one. So web application 2ZZ000. And let me say central India. Okay. So the region itself is completely unavailable. Like you do not have this particular service in the entire region, Sanjay. So that particular region isn't supporting, web applications as such.
Okay.
So
And
yeah,
sorry,
yeah,
go ahead.
yeah. I mean to say that all these services are, very regional specific. Like you do not have the service, like, let's say in India. So you'll have to switch to another any other region where the service is kind of, already available out there.
Okay. For example, I created resource group in the central India. So now
Hmm.
web app I can create in different region, right?
Yes, you can create it in a region. No relation between the resource group and the resources inside it.
Okay. Yeah, that's it from mine. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay, can we publish our customized application to the PAAS?
Yes, you can. Like customize application as in like are you developing in any particular language, like any particular language that is outside the language that is supported by the web applications?
For example, small schools, some schools
Hmm.
have their own application to enter their
Right. Hmm.
students details.
Hmm.
So they want to publish their application onto the cloud and they can
Hmm.
use.
Yes. So for our demo, I am, basically even when we did, let's say the IIS demo, right? I was just taking a very simple .NET application. I just took a very, very simple .NET application, which is like very bare basic from a boilerplate template, and I just published it out. But if I were a developer, if let's say I were someone who's from a development background, then I can improve my application, add databases to it, add a lot of stuff to it, and publish to a web application or let's say the IIS server. So it supports a wide range of server-side encryption. Web application supports a wide range of databases like Cassandra, SQL, Cosmos, Mongo. A lot of things basically are supported by web applications as well. So if you're developing in a language that is supported by the web application, like let's say either .NET, Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, Node, like six of any of these languages, whatever you develop is supported by the web application. Your application can be as simple as let's say hello world, or as complex as let's say the cybersecurity applications and also. So they do in short.
Okay.
Any further questions, guys, before we go ahead and get started with today's session?
But web app and app service plan should be in the same region, right?
Exactly. So your web app and app service plan should be in the same region, because the it's like a relation between a VNet and a VM. So it can your VNet cannot be in one region and your VM cannot be in another. For both of them to basically communicate with each other, they have to be in the same region. So when you create a web application, when you select a region, for example, let's say something like central US, okay, I selected something like a central US out here, and I basically said, okay, fine, this is like a .NET core application basically that I want to publish out here. It is automatically given me a plan. Now if I basically change it to Australia East, the plan will also change. The plan is also going to get created in, let's say, Australia East. So this is how it works, Akila.
Yeah, fine.
Any further questions, guys? Okay, just give me one quick second. I'll have to switch to a different account because this particular account, I do not have the credentials basically for that. So let me switch back to a different account altogether and then create a web application inside that so that we can have a demo there. Okay, great. Don't want to sign in, don't want to see signed in. Great, not a problem. So I'll firstly go ahead, create a very sample resource group out here. And are everyone able to see even my incognito window? Like even this is visible, right? Because sometimes in the screen sharing, this will not be visible. So
Yes.
is everyone able to? Yeah, great.
Yes.
Yes.
Sample web app. And just say I created a resource group out here. And now I'll just go ahead and let's say create a web application inside it. So I'll say okay, fine. Web application. And I'll basically create a very simple web application basically in let's say in a region like East US 2. And like web application test to ABC, something like this. I'll say it is code. Runtime stack is .NET Core 3.1. LTS, which is long-term support. I'll say East US 2. And guys, now you're able to see the change size option also, right? When we were able to create in this particular account, I did not even have this option to change size. It's like by default, going ahead and creating something in F1. Like, can anyone tell me why this is like this in this particular account?
Pay as you go
Because
As you go.
subscription.
Exactly.
yeah. Yes.
It's a pay-as-you-go subscription. So it's a pay-as-you-go account out here that basically that I'm using. So I am, I am being given an extra flexibility to go ahead and decide which plan that I want to, kind of select. So you can also select the plan from here. You can also basically go ahead and select your pricing tier from here. So to begin with, I'll say I'll create it in an F1 tier, not to just to begin with this, with this particular demo. I'll say next. I don't need this particular option. Disable this out. I don't need even monitoring out. I'll say no to monitoring. I'll say tags and review and create. So as of now, I'm just creating an app service plan and an app service inside it. And as and when I create an app service, guys, as we seen yesterday, Microsoft is going to give you a very sample, a HTML document inside it, which just displays you a welcome page telling that, hey, application developers, welcome to the web app development. You can, publish your code using all that stuff. And web applications again support a wide range of integration. Like it does support FTP, it does support Visual Studio, it does support Eclipse, it does support Visual Studio Code, a lot of things out there. So if you have, or if you are someone who's coming from a different IDE other than, integrated development environment other than Visual Studio, web applications also have a support to that. So how do we publish the code out here? Like 5 years back, this is how we used to do it. Like for example, I have a web application that has got created, and my web application is let's say running on web app test 2abc dot azure websites.net and stuff. Now what I'm gonna do is like I have a Visual Studio console open along with me, and it's just the code, basically a very simple boilerplate template. Guys, is everyone comfortable in creating this particular code, or do I just start from the very scratch of it?
Actually, I'm unable to install Visual Studio because that much
Mhm.
resource is not available. So, is there any alternate we can have the code and try it?
So spin up a virtual machine and then create a Visual Studio under it. That's the the
Okay.
best solution that I can provide to you. Like spin up a Windows 10 Pro virtual machine, a home operating system, and then install a Visual Studio on top of it so that you can destroy it at any point in time.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
So guys, is everyone able to create this particular code, like just this particular boilerplate template out here? Like if there's anyone who's facing an issue, please let me know. I'll create it, right from the starting again. Okay.
Please do it. No,
Okay,
I
sure.
won't receive.
Fine. So what I'll do is, like, I am at this page, so even if I like close and open this out, I'll still get the same page out. So I'll say new, like file, new, and then project. And now it'll say, hey, you know what? I have a lot of projects on the offer, have a lot of templates on the offer. What is the code that you actually want to go ahead and develop? I'll either search ASP.NET Core and then a web application, or I already have this open out here, or I can also select the recently used templates and I can say next. And now it's going to ask me what is the name of the solution basically that you want to go ahead and create. I'll say this is a test application, and select a path, and I'll say create a new solution out there and say next. And it says okay, fine, what kind of a .NET framework that you want to go for. And since my web application is published in, let's say, a .NET Core 3.1, right, I'll go ahead and select a .NET Core 3.1 LTS, long term support, and I'll say create. And now it'll just go ahead and create me a boilerplate project as such, which is like a very basic project as such, like with a very minimal feature and etc. And even if your developer needs to create one, right, they'll start from this only. They'll start from this particular template and they'll go ahead and add a lot of things called controllers and all that stuff. So even if a developer were to come ahead and do this, they'll do the same thing. They'll come there and they'll go ahead and, let's say, create this entire project in such a way. So Ali, are you okay with this?
Yes, it's okay.
Okay. So now again, the problem that I have right now is that this particular code, right, whatever I've developed, it's in a high level language, meaning a human readable language that I and you basically can understand this. But my web app, who is nothing but a virtual machine in the backend running on an IIS server, doesn't understand this particular code out here. It doesn't really understand this code because it's developed in a high level language like .NET Core. So it needs me to basically go ahead and convert this into a language what the web application understands. That language is a binary language, meaning zeros and ones, because that's the language what every computer, or any computer in the world, kind of understands it. So if I basically have this code out here, okay, if I basically go into, let's say, the particular folder in which the code is there, if I take the entire code as such and just deploy it or just do an FTP into the web application, meaning if I copy all these things into the web application using WinACP, it won't work. It will just throw an error telling that, these folder doesn't seem to be right, or the files doesn't seem to be right, and it'll start throwing a lot of errors out there. A lot of application errors start popping up out there, which I don't want to do. First thing is that I need to convert my code from a very high level language to a very basic language what a web application can understand, which is binaries or DLLs, one and the same. Then how do I convert it? The process of conversion is called a build. And for a build to happen, in my laptop, I have something known as a .NET Core SDK. .NET Core SDK basically installed on my laptop, which is software development kit, and it has a file called .NET.exe. because I have this all these things basically set up, I can go ahead and do a build of my solution. I can either basically build my solution or build the application as such. This is like the individual application basically that I'm kind of building out. But even before that, let me go ahead and do a bit of customization. Let me say index.html and let me say not welcome but custom application, and I don't need all these things out. I say this is the version 1 of my custom app or custom application as such. Save this out. Now what I want to do is that I want to go ahead and publish this entire code onto my web application. So what I said is that first we need to build. So do you need to always build it? Like, do you need to always go ahead and click this option? You can basically go ahead and click this to check whether you're doing all fine or not. It will take a minute. It will build your application, meaning it will convert your application to something known as DLLs or to something known as binaries, and it will keep your application ready. Now it says, you know what, this is application which is built and all that stuff. And see, if you look at this particular folder out here, everything is in the form of a DL. This is what my web application really expects. That, hey, you know what, I need something like this along with something known as a test application as such. And everything else, like something called DLL, configuration files and all these things, are applications or files that support my application to run, that support my main application to run. So if I did not build it, I wouldn't have got all these things out. So since I built it, I went ahead and basically I was able to get something like this. Now what am I going to do? See guys, this is a process called build, right? Now this is a manual procedure what we used to do 5 years ago. No one is doing this right now. No one is coming here and doing a build out here right now. This is now being used as something known as a CI pipeline in Azure DevOps, continuous integration pipeline in Azure DevOps. We'll see, because this is like a very core concept on what we need to cover, because the entire class is basically based out of Azure DevOps as such. So this is something that we will again cover and understand more depth about it. So, but this process is obsolete. No longer this is being used, but you need to understand how it was used so that you can appreciate the automation of it. So I built it. Now what I'll do is that I'll release it, meaning I'll publish my code on top of a web application. And this process is called release. In Azure DevOps, the same thing is called continuous deployment, CD pipelines. So I'll say my application is Azure web app that is sitting on a Windows. I'll say next, and I'll say basically, okay, fine, this is the account basically that I want to use, and it automatically detected that what, you have a web application. You can go ahead and publish this out here. So I just selected my web application and I said finish. And now it's gonna say, hey, you know what, okay, fine, this is the publishing profile that I kind of created for you. Are you good with this? I'll say I just need one more thing out here. I'll just need to edit the configuration, and I'll also make sure to delete all the files that are not a part of my solution. So I'll say remove additional files in the destination, because that in some point can cause issues and all. I'll say publish. The first thing it'll try to do is that it'll try to establish a connection to the web application. And does the web application allow remote connections? Yes, it does. Did I have to do any networking? No, I did not. It is a platform managed service again. And now what it's doing is that it firstly built my application out here, and now it is publishing my application into the root folder of the web application, guys. If you see this, right, it is www root. This is the folder what I'm using in order to publish all my code, all the code that got built. So it's saying adding this directory and all that stuff, and it'll go basically, and it basically deployed something on top of my web application. And now I have something called as a custom application. This is my version 1.0 of my custom application, which is running out of my web application. Where is it? Okay, I can just close this out. Which is running out of this particular web app. Even if I browse this out, I'll get the same thing. This is the current, or this is the 1.0 of my current application or my custom application. This is something that I have kind of written in my index.html page. This is where I came and basically I wrote this out. And look how simple the deployment has actually become for me. If I were to do the same thing, let's say on a Windows machine, or basically on a Windows VM that is running on an IIS server, I will first have to do something called as networking, where I have to unblock a port called 8172. I have to allow remote connections. I have to install web deploy. I have to install .NET Core SDK and all that stuff. Everything else is being managed by Azure right now. I've handed over all the management to Azure. I said, you know what, you take care of all this headache. I don't want that management. Give me an application that I can actually use. That's it. Give me just an application that I can actually go ahead and use this out and use it readily out of the box. I don't want to do anything. I don't want to take the management overhead. Just great. But applications as such. Okay, before I move forward, guys, any questions here? Any questions with this process?
Uploading the application will be taken care by developer, right?
It was,
Because they're
but
using.
right now, it was taken care by the developers, but now the responsibility has shifted to the DevOps engineers. So it is our playground right now.
Okay. They will
So
give the their application data, and
yes,
then we need to upload.
they will develop the application and give it to you. But earlier when I basically started off my career, it was that they were developing the application and giving it to me, let's say over an email, let's say over a Teams chat. They're attaching things and sending it out. But right now things have changed drastically. Things have changed a lot. Right now, me being a DevOps engineer, I do not have to basically contact a developer for the application. We have a very secure way of sharing all the code and all that stuff. Everything is automated, Sanjay.
Okay.
Everything now is automated. But earlier, yes, it used to happen like this. Like they used to give the code, and being a DevOps engineer, I used to take the code, build the code, deploy the code on top of my target. So whatever errors I get there, it is my responsibility to fix that out.
Got it.
Now, any further questions, guys, with this particular process?
And you ran the code, right? So we should install the .NET Core language.
So whenever I install, let's say, Visual Studio in my laptop, right, Akila, I installed a couple of dependencies like ASP.NET Development and all that stuff. So that will itself take care of installing .NET Core and all that stuff in my laptop. So Visual Studio itself will, take care of all that dependencies.
Okay.
Okay, so I did a custom application out here and I was able to go ahead and deploy it. And the deployment time basically that I basically had was about, let's say, 10 seconds or 20 seconds. That's the maximum time it took to go ahead and deploy it. But actual applications are not like that. Actual applications are actually far more sophisticated than what we are developing right now. They can have a lot of controllers, a lot of buttons basically here, a lot of pages basically associated with it, meaning I'm talking about a full blown application. Let's say in our example irctc.co.in. Now we have moved, or irctc.co.in basically has evolved a lot over, let's say, the years. Initially they only had rail ticket reservations, then they came up with hotel reservations inside that. Then they came up with tour packages and all that. That meaning there is a development team in the backend who's like continuously developing the application, releasing the application onto the platform wherever it is sitting in. Let's imagine in our case, it is sitting on top of a web app. And every time they release the application, they at least need 20 or 25 minutes in order to go ahead and deploy it. What we did in 10 seconds, they might take about, or it might take about somewhere around 20 or 25 minutes as such. Meaning every deployment that I'm going out here, or every deployment that I'm taking out here, is taking at least 20 minutes. So I have a web app, only one web application out here, and I am sitting on my local machine, and I am doing all my deployments using the Visual Studio installed on top of my local machine. So I have my local machine, I have my web application, I'm taking my applications and deploying on top of the web application. Now I have deployed what? The version 1 of my application. So this web application is right now running on a version 1. Now am I satisfied with the version 1? Certainly not. I want to basically increment my application to, let's say, a version 2.0, right? So I want to make sure that I increment my application to a version 2.0. So what will I do right now is that I'll come down to my code, or my developer will come down to my code, and I'm just editing one simple line out here. But in actual development, it is not like this. They'll have to develop a lot of things when they move from one version to the other. So I did a very simple editing, but it'll take months and basically sometimes years in order to develop a new application as such. So I'm basically putting a version 2.0 out here. The only thing I'm right now doing is like I'm saying, okay, fine, great. I'll go to my publishing profile. I'll publish it back again. So all I'm doing again is just editing that particular file. I said it is version 2 right now that is being developed. I tested it on my local machine. It was working fine. There was no issues. I am now releasing on top of the platform. Now this is where your question comes in, Sanjay, that you know what, can we do a rollback? Then how do we do a rollback? If basically I realize my application is not working as I expected, then how do I really do my rollback? Now this is the version 2 basically of my application. There are two issues with this deployment. One, there isn't basically an option to roll this back. Why do I need to roll it back? In case, let's say I deployed my code called version 2.0 here. Now it is not version 1, it is version 2 that went ahead and sat on top of my web application. See, it is version 2 out here. Now as and when I release my version 2, a lot of users started complaining that you know what, the application is not working fine, not working properly, but it was working fine in my local machine. But local machine is not actually an environment where I can test it out. Because when you actually go into a production kind of an environment, meaning this is my production right now. Production meaning a live web application. When you actually go to, let's say, a production kind of an environment, there are a lot of complexities which are involved, like the number of users, the number of traffic, all these things basically get involved out here. So now you realize that you know what, your version 2.0 is not working as such. Then what do? Your application is down. What do you do right now is that now the development team tells, hey, you know what, I'll have to now revert back, or I have to roll back to a previous version. I have to make sure that this rollback is fast, is quick, because the application is down, but I don't have the code. I've already changed it. I've already changed my code. Here it is like very simple for me to just go to a backspace, do a 1.0 and publish it out there. But for a developer, actually, it is a lot more. There is a lot more that they need to revert back. But where are those changes? There are no changes that I published. There is nothing basically that I have that I can go back to a previous version. This is the first issue that I have. Secondly, even when I do all that stuff and let's say do a rollback to it, let's say the developer did like about, did take about 3 or 4 days. Basically, there were a lot of developers who were working on that. In 3 to 4 days, your application was down, your business took a big hit. Fine, not a problem. But now what I did is that I said, okay, fine, I have my version 1 back again. I'll save this out, go back, publish it out back again. Second issue is that every time I publish it, my application is down at least for half an hour. This is a very simple code. Your application is not even down right now because it's just taking some seconds to load things out. But when you're dealing with complex applications, your application is at least, let's say, down for the 30 or 45 minutes where your business is taking a hit. So two issues. One is where is my previous code in let's say in the case of failure. In the point of failures, where is my previous code? Two is how do I reduce the time for my deployment? Two issues out here basically that I'm right now facing. And both the issues are actually answered by a concept called deployment slots. If I go into my web application, I have an option here which is called deployment slots under the deployment. By default, your web application is given one slot which is called as production, which is now called as production. And by default, all your code goes in here. Now there is an emergence, or there is basically the whole industry right now is on a unanimous song that we need something called as a zero downtime deployment, and we need something called as reliable deployments. Meaning, just in case, in our case, what we did is like we went on to 2.0. A lot of customers were starting, a lot of complaints out about it. Now I need to roll it back to a 1.0 version. Can I do it, or how can I do it using this particular concept? Now, the first and very basic thing that we'll have to know about it is that deployment slots are not supported in F1 plan. F1 doesn't support deployment slots. You'll have to be minimum on an S1 if I'm not wrong. You'll have to minimum be on an S1, meaning I'll have to firstly scale myself up. How do I scale myself up? I come down into something called scale up and I go to a higher SKU. So how do I decide which SKU is like better for me? Select an option. Does it support deployment slots? No. Does this support deployment slots? No. Go to production. Does this support deployment slots? Yes. Slots. This is the option what I'm really looking out there for. I'll say okay, fine, this is great. Apply the minimum basically scale out here. So I'll say it is S1 that I basically applied this out. It'll cost me about 5,000 rupees per month. But if I'm using for an hour, not that a great cost, like not that basically a scale of it. So okay, fine. Now I'll come back to the deployment slots out here. And now I'm able to see something known as a slot called, you have something known as a production slot. You can go ahead and add multiple slots out here. I say great. This is a very good option that I can actually leverage. I say add a slot and I'll say okay, fine, testing slot. Now you see, as when I added this, right, it's now telling me the web application name that I'm going to create, meaning whenever you create a slot, it's going to create another web application, a replica web application, which is called testing slot dot my main application hyphen something like this. The name would be something like this. I'll say add, which is great. And after it got added, we'll go into the resource group and we'll see how it looks like. So it's now saying, okay, fine, I'm going ahead and creating a slot for you, which is called a testing slot out there. And now you can use this slot to stage your changes, to stage your deployments. That's the reason these are called staging slots, guys. So it took around like less than a minute, and it said, what, I created a slot for you. And if I go into, let's say, my resource group and do a couple of refreshes out here, I have the main web application, which is my app service. Type as an app service. I have a child under it, which is called a testing slot, and type as app service parenthesis slot. So I am now given an option of something known as a slots out here. Now how do I use it? Now I am back onto my version 1. My application is back, let's say, onto my version 1 right now, because I rolled it back because it was not working fine, and for a number of reasons it was not really working out there for me. So I rolled this out back. Now what am I gonna do is like I'm gonna say okay, fine, now I'm planning to increment changes. Now my developer is now basically keen on developing things out. So incremented it, and let's close this out, not a problem. Now I'll say okay, fine, publish this out, give me a new publishment. I'll say a new, I'll say target is Azure App Service Windows. Yes, this is the right account and this is the right web app, but I don't want to deploy right away on my web application. I want to make sure to deploy my code onto a staging area which is called a slot. How do I get it? It now says you have a deployment slot associated with it, and I see you have something known as a testing slot here. I select my testing slot and I'll say yes, this is where I want to actually publish my application. Create a new publishing profile, edit my configuration, and just make sure to enable this option out. And now I'll publish my changes. Now my version 2 is not actually going to, let's say, the main application as such, but rather it is actually going and setting inside something known as a slot. So users who are using my application are still great, they're still enjoying 1.0, they are still not complaining anything, but in the backend now is where I am going ahead and rolling out a couple of updates. But I'm not rolling out updates on, let's say, the application directly. I want to basically roll it out to, let's say, a staging area and incrementally open up my application. So how do I do it? So let me first deploy this out on, let's say, a slot out there. So this will take like about a minute or so, and if it's a complex application it will take a lot of time, but even during that time you do not have a downtime on your application. You do not have a downtime on your application. Now what happens really is that when you basically publish things out, let's say, when you basically deploy something, the first thing that Azure is going to do is that it's going to stop your web application, deploy changes, and then restart it. That's how your web application will pick up the updated configuration. Now what has happened is that it said, you know what, I deployed it on a slot, and restarting the web app, see, it's restarting the application, and now it is giving me something known as a slot out here. Now if you see the link, right, it is web test to abc hyphen testing slot dot azure websites.net, and the version is 2.0. But my production that the people are looking at, the people are seeing, is still running on 1.0. It is not impacted. It is not impacted in any ways, but I have a testing opportunity right now. What I can do is I can test my application using this particular, because right now my application is not running on a local machine. It is running on the cloud, it's running on the web application, which has the same configuration as my production. So this is right now running on my web application, which has the same configuration as my production is. And I can test this out, and once I'm satisfied with my testing, I'll say okay, fine, great. I have two applications right now, guys. Like one, my production, which is like web to abc.azurewebsites.net. The other being my slot, which is to abc.testingslot.azurewebsite.net, which is running on a 2.0 code out here. Now I'm satisfied with my testing. I'm like great. I said okay, fine, which is superb, which is great, which is a very good option. And now go to my deployment slots. Now is the time where I want to basically change the code that is there on my main slot. My main slot has a code, or my production slot has a code .1.0. My testing slot has a code .2.0. Now I want to swap it. What I'll do is I'll say okay, great, swap. I'll say target or source, basically any which ways, like any direction is okay with me. I'll say okay, fine, the sources, I can also say the source is like testing slot out here, target is web app to abc, great. I'll say swap. This is going to take a lot lesser time than your deployments take, and this will not restart your web application. It will not do a lot of things out. So you're essentially reducing your downtime to less than a minute out here. Like when you have a huge code out there, this particular swap option really gets your downtime, let's say, to less than a minute or so. So this is going to take like about a minute or so to swap this out. And once the swap is done, what is going to happen is something this. Your 1.0 version is now going to be pulled into the slot called testing slot, and the code that is sitting in this particular testing slot is going to get deployed on let's say the production slot, and the users will now be able to see 2.0 version basically that is running, let's say, on your production slot as such. Now in case, let's say, you now discover that there are still some issues, people are not able to now go ahead and, let's say, interact with a lot of features in my 2.0. Can it happen? Definitely yes, it can happen. If let's say it's happening something like this, then I can immediately do a reswap or a rollback, because I do not have my code basically on my local right now. My code is safely saved on, let's say, the cloud, on, let's say, into a slot, and the slot right now has the last known good version. We call this as LKG, last known good, or the previously known good, PKG, and something like that. Like, it depends upon the terminology. It has the last known good, and I can basically reswap my entire application. Meaning right now, if I close this out and if I go into my testing application, this in all likely would have been running in, let's say, version 1.0, and my see it's like running on version 1.0, which is my testing. My production right now will be running on something like 2.0. Now if let's say I say, you know what, this is not running fine, you can come down and do a reswap or a rollback. This essentially is giving me an option to do zero downtime deployments, guys. This basically will enable me to go ahead and do a zero downtime deployment as such. This is how I can make use of something known as slots, and how many number of slots that I can go ahead depends upon your plan. In my case, it is 5. I can have 5 additional slots apart from production, and the higher you go, the greater you go, the greater will be the amount of slots basically that you can actually go for. So this is how is the application of the concept, guys. This is how we go ahead and, let's say, apply the concept while our deployments. So any questions in this?
We have upgraded from deployment or test to production, right? So once we deploy this, the new code with the new version with the slot, can we go back to the F1 free version with this step
If
out?
you go, I mean, you can do that, but you'll lose your slots again.
Okay.
Like if you scale down yourself, you're
Yeah.
going to lose an option called the slot. You won't be able to see the slot anymore.
Okay.
You lose this functionality. So you'll have to minimum be on an S1 tier in order to make use of this particular functionality as such.
Okay.
So by swapping, we converted the web app server from 1.1.0 version to 1.0 version, right now? 1.2.
I mean, from 1.0 to 2.0, yes.
Yeah.
And we did a reswap just in case, if your 2.0 is not working fine on production. I also did a reswap right now to get it back to 1.0, and it came back to 1.0. I didn't even have to go to my Visual Studio and do all that stuff. And my testing right now has a 2.0, and my developer, let's say, has a good amount of time right now to, let's say, go ahead and, let's say, rework on the 2.0 version of it. Does it answer your question, Akila?
Yes.
Any more questions with this, guys? Now, there are also a couple of cases where I will have to interact with the virtual machine that is sitting in the backend, guys. Meaning I have a web application out here. I said this is nothing but a virtual machine sitting in the backend, exposed as a web application to you all, so that you can just use this particular service. Sometimes I need to go into the backend and see what is the code that got deployed. Are there any issues? Are there any issues with, let's say, my deployment? Or what is the kind of deployment that I actually went ahead and made it out there? Or what is basically the issue with my code? Or sometimes what happens is that developers come to you and say, hey, you know what? I need to change a very small setting in the code. I need to test something to see, let's say, whether the code is running fine or not. I need to do a very small test. Can you help me out with that? By default, can you interact with this box? No, this is managed service. But there is a slight tweak to it. Azure web applications come with something known as a Kudu console. The name is KUDU. Kudu console or advanced tools, which will help you get to the root of your application, or which will help you get to the C drive of the virtual machine on which this particular web application is running, and give you, let's say, like limited amount of functionality. Now in my case, I want to see what is the code that got deployed, how it got deployed. If it was a virtual machine, I would have just gone into that inet pub folder into www root, and I would have seen what is basically in there. But let's say I am on a PAAS service. Can I see that? I can of course see that. I'll have to go into something known as advanced tools, and now it says, hey, you know what, this is the Kudu console basically that I'm presenting out to you. I'll say go. Now this particular thing will take me to the back end of my machine, or it will take me to the root directory, or it will take me to, let's say, the virtual machine on which this particular service is actually running. And does everyone have it? I mean, everyone have access to it? No, not really. Not everyone will have access to it. Only administrators, only web app administrators or contributors will have access to it, and not everyone will get an access, like, or not everyone will have the access as a contributor. This is how the Kudu console actually looks like. Here is where I basically have my ID out here, telling that this is the account that basically you are logged into, and here is where I can interact with it. And if I click on environment, it will now say, hey, you know what, this is the system information that I can give you, that you are using a Windows NT 10. It's like, this particular OS is, let's say, a Windows 10 operating system. It's a 64-bit operating system. Processor is one, machine name is something like this. This is the name of the virtual machine that got created in the backend, guys. This is the name of the virtual machine that got created when I created a PAAS service, meaning Azure in the backend spinned up a virtual machine, installed everything that it had to do, and give me something like a PAAS service out here. And now it's telling, hey, you know what, this is the directory, this is, let's say, all these things basically that I have out here, everything that is getting installed and all that stuff. You'll have also .NET Core and all, basically. See, the .NET basically telemetry is also installed. You have a lot of things basically that got installed out there in this way. But I'm not interested in all these things out here. Right? It basically has all the information what your system needs, and you can take it for automation. But I'm not interested in all these things. I am interested to see what is the code basically that got deployed. I'm interested to see one particular folder which is called www root. Can I see that? Definitely yes. I'll say not the environment but debug console, CMD or PowerShell, anything is okay. I'll say PowerShell. And it will take a minute, and it will take me to the root of it. Like, this is like very like very limited functionality thing. And now I'll say okay, fine. Site root. This is the entire code basically that I deployed from my local machine. Like this is literally the entire code what I kind of deployed from my local machine out here. Everything that was there from my local machine into my code. And if I still go into, let's say, root, I have a lot of things like classes, CSS, and all that stuff. And I'll probably even look at the index.html file, HTML file, which is hosting out my website out here. So in very rare case scenarios, in very I wouldn't say rare case scenarios, because this is something that I do on a daily basis in order to help my developers. So in scenario something like this, where you want to do a small backend change and want to test it out, you want to basically test something out, you can come down and you can actually edit the files out here. For example, web.config. I can say, you know what, I want to edit something out. So I can basically say, edit this out into something like true. It was false, it was true. Save this and give a web application a restart in order to pick up the latest configuration. In order to, let's say, pick up the latest configuration, you'll have to go ahead and restart this out. So very popular question is that, can you interact with the root folder of your web application being a PAAS service? Yes, you can. There's a limited functionality out here. Though it is limited, it's very powerful. Believe me, this is something that I use on a very daily basis. Though this is very limited, this is like very, very, very useful. So I went into the root and I'm able to see all the root folders that is running on my C drive of the virtual machine on which this web application is actually running on. This is how I can go ahead and, let's say, interact, let's say, with the root directories and root folders, guys. And how do I get here? Go into something known as, or type in something known as advanced and just say go. You'll fall into this particular page and you can go ahead from here. Any questions with this, guys? Anything, guys? Anything? Does anyone have any questions, guys, that I can take?
We can edit the code here also.
I'm sorry?
So we can edit the code here also.
You can, but highly suggested that not to, because you're changing the configuration from the backend, and this particular configuration, right, it's not maintained anywhere if you change it from the backend. So highly suggested not to. We highly discourage our developers not to ask us to go ahead and make a change to the code, because firstly, we are not developers, we are DevOps engineers. We do not have an idea on what we are changing. Secondly, it is very important for me to note where I am maintaining the state configuration of my code. Like if I make this change, where is it being recorded, or where is it being basically stored? Where is this particular change being stored? If it's not stored anywhere, then I would highly discourage not to go ahead and do it. Very, very, very rare conditions is where we will go ahead and make very small changes, not to the code, but to the configuration of the code. A very minute configuration, so that the developers can test it and rework on their code and give us a fresh code again. So this is how things work, guys. Does it answer your question, Akila? Okay, any further questions out here?
Yeah, you're telling about code and configuration code. Means, what is the difference, means, to understand?
See, there is.
You're telling we can modify the configuration code. So I just want to understand.
Okay, so there is something called the core of the code, like let's say the .exe files, the .dls and all that stuff. There is something called as configuration, which will direct how your code will run. Like whether it's a 64-bit operating system with 32-bit basically, or what kind of, let's say for example, if I have something, a file called appsetting.json, this code is configured to give me information level logs. I can change it to warning. meaning I'm making a configuration change but not a code change. If I were basically to go ahead and edit into the root of it, like let's say go into the root and edit something, do something fancy out here, go into let's say bootstrap and do something, edit some file out here, I am doing a direct code change which will affect the state of my application. But this is a configuration change that is supporting my code, which is supporting the way my code is actually running. So this is what I am talking about. Does it answer your question, Sanjay?
Yeah, got it. And real time to track it, will they raise some tickets or just how it will be if they want to
Uh,
deploy some code, new code or version?
okay, so again, that's again a whole very very different process altogether. Like there are a lot of teams that get involved. So that is something that I'll take up in a concept called Azure DevOps when we go there.
Okay, okay, sure.
So the roadmap, how is it going to be from now? Is that PAAS is like a limited blanket of things. Like most of the things basically are covered when we do Azure DevOps as such. So I will cover this particular service. I have a couple of more things here to cover, something like configuration, something like auto scale, networking, and high availability using something known as a traffic manager. And I will also show how your web application, like a very simple web application, can connect to a service like an Azure SQL database or an Azure storage account, like the connection between those two, and another service known as an Azure Key Vault. So these are the couple of things what we're going to do in the coming week. Like I will take somewhere around 3 or 4 days in the next week basically to go ahead and explain all these services out. And once that is done, we will start off with Azure DevOps. Like all we need right now to start Azure DevOps is that in order for you to implement a practice called DevOps, you need to understand a cloud called Azure, and we have a good understanding right now with Azure. And now is a time where we need to slowly slip into, let's say, the automation side of things using Azure DevOps and CI/CD pipelines and a lot of things as such. So Azure DevOps is going to be our core area. We are going to discuss something like Azure repos, Azure CI pipelines, Azure CD pipelines, policies, and all that stuff. It's going to take like about 7 to 10 days basically for me to in order to cover that out. After that, covering after once we are comfortable with Azure DevOps, like I am okay to again and again basically give you all the classes for Azure DevOps, because that is going to be the core area where you guys will be working on. Like right now when we look at virtual machines and everything, you may or may not work on it. The probability you may not, because it's a bit of administrator work that basically things are delivered on an administration. But as a DevOps engineer you need to understand, because if you basically are a DevOps engineer, Microsoft expects you to basically have a certification called AZ400. AZ400 is a certification what Microsoft recommends basically for you to have if basically you are a Microsoft DevOps solution expert. For having this particular certification, Microsoft expects you to either come from a development background or an administration background. Like for you to take this particular examination, you have two more exams basically that you need to take, part of the requirements for this. The requirement for this examination is either you be a certified administrator or a certified developer. A certified administrator is what you can take right now with something known as an AZ104. And after that, you will basically need to take this particular exam called AZ400. And that's when you'll basically go ahead and get certified with something known as an Azure DevOps. If you're coming from a development background, you have an option called AZ204. You can either go with one of the path. But since we are not really looking at developing things and stuff, that's where I went ahead and covered the AZ104 part of the entire syllabus as such. Now everything what I kind of delivered, I have taken out the bits and pieces from AZ104, and everything what I'll be covering will be taken from AZ400. So a combination of both of things will make you a complete DevOps engineer as such. So will you be doing point to site? Will you be managing virtual machines? Will you be managing a lot of things in the backend? You may not be in especially let's say in very big organizations. There are separate teams for networking, there are separate teams for active directory, there are separate teams for let's say DevOps engineers and all that stuff. So there is a good amount of separation. If you go for a startup, a very small company, then yes, you will be handling a lot of things by your own. Like there is no good separation between teams because they want to do a lot of cost reduction and etc. But anyways, even if you fall let's say in a big organization, you'll have to basically understand what is going on the backend, for which you'll have all these basics basically, which will really help you out. But Azure DevOps, you'll definitely do it because that's what you're hired for. You're hired as a DevOps engineer as such, so that's where basically your expertise is like used. So that's the reason I'll have a very high emphasis, or rather a very high focus on Azure DevOps as such, and that will start like let's say in the next 4 to 5 days, guys. So this is the roadmap what we are going to look at. And once everyone is comfortable with Azure DevOps is when we'll go ahead and explore the open source part of it, like Jenkins, uh, Octopus, Dockers, and Kubernetes, and also Terraform. This is how the path forward is going to be, guys. So is everyone comfortable? Any questions with this?
If we are doing configuration changes,
Mm-hmm.
is it going to means without restarting any services, it will going to affect the means
Yes,
it
it
will
will.
going
Yes,
update it.
it'll impact the nature your application will run. Like if you do a configuration change also, it will impact the nature your application will run, but it will not impact the user interface as such. It will not impact the the user experience as such. So that's the reason we do it. We make all the configuration changes whatever we need, not in the production, but in let's say an environment which is not like production. For example, in our case, staging. Like do whatever changes you want in staging, because people, if they get affected, only the internal employees get affected. Like only the people like developers and everyone who's testing it will get affected, and they need to be affected to understand the change and understand what is happening and all, to make a better development and as such. But in production, highly advisable, highly recommended not to do it. Does it answer your question, Srikant?
Yes.
Okay, so if there are no further questions, then I'm going to close the session for today, and we can meet on Monday and we can discuss more on PAAS and then move on to Azure DevOps side of things.
Thank you.
And yeah, thank you. Have a great day ahead, guys.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.